Yes.
Thank you, Sir Brian. We just finished before the break looking at the role of the headmaster and other members of staff at the school. I'm going to briefly touch upon other characters and personae at the time. Dr. Rainsford, you're aware, joined the school from 1968 onwards. We've heard how he set up the research coagulation laboratory at the school, funded by a grant to the school. I'm not going to call it up, but I will draw your attention to WITN 7547 002_004. That's a letter on the 14th of February 1969 from the school warden to two parents referring to the hiring of Dr. Rainsford, who was to be concerned with the welfare of the boys suffering haemophilia and will cooperate with and advise staff of the Treloar Hospital regarding their treatment, to work under the direction of Dr. Biggs. Excuse me. Another document I seek to highlight for you, which is touched upon in our written submissions, is SWCX 603_008. This was the grant application to extend the grant used to employ Dr. Rainsford. And I flagged it up merely for you to note that it's a joint application being made on the 1st of August 1975 by both the chair of the school and the NHS orthopaedic surgeon, essentially to submit that it would appear that both sides of the coin knew what was going on in terms of any research and trials. If I could then, Lawrence, WITN 7547 002_302. And this is a letter from September 1967 to the same parents. I think somebody needs to turn the phone off. It's all right. Okay, thank you. It's the first paragraph. Halfway down, I'll draw your attention beginning. There are nearly 40 haemophiliacs in the college. Thank you, Lawrence. And we have long felt that they provide an opportunity for research which should not be missed and which we hope will result in improved methods of treatment.
Just close everybody. Yes.
Thank you. This is from the school warden to those same parents. Okay, and then if we go down, essentially, mindful of time, the comments of the warden indicate the school's knowledge that medical research was a feature from 1967 onwards. That's when the lab was operational, together with the school's and the clinician's perception that the boys attending that school were potential research cohorts for them. This is a slightly different USP of the college, or unique selling point, than that was sold to the parents and the boys, with different objectives potentially in mind. I think I've already addressed Dr. Tomlinson, so I won't trouble you any further with her role, but I will say a few words about Dr. Aaronstrom, if I may. You will recall, so that he undertook his dissertation studying the boys at the college over a 5-year period. You will recall from Mr. Richards' comprehensive detailed presentation that he was heavily involved in many research projects and trials throughout the 1970s and the 1980s. You will recall as well at TREL 5012_113, sorry, thank you, Lars, that he obtained a generic consent form which didn't identify any specific products or any specific risks or any rights of the patients, just participation with unspecified factor concentrates. He essentially gave himself a free hand. You will also recall that HHFT 301201 underscore 004 that he undertook trials to make comparisons between different competing commercial products, Armour and Haemophil. You will also recall his interactions with the pharmaceutical companies, RLIT 40104 in the acknowledgement section confirms grants were provided to the college to fund research by Armour Pharmaceutical. HHFT 301201 underscore 003 sets out for you Armour being involved in the protocols for research as well as reimbursing costs incurred upon receipt of an invoice when the research funds were exhausted. You may recall in December 1980 at BAYP 5021 underscore 063, the minutes of a Qatar Laboratories board meeting, which recorded that Qatar were looking into providing some form of financial support for a research fellowship to Dr. Aaronstrom after its representatives had made promises to him to that effect to try and boost their sales. And you will recall from the presentations the Spaywood trials of humanate products were boys selected who then became infected with HIV. In essence, Russian roulette was played with their lives for farmers' benefit. And the inquiry may wish to question, how was any of those interactions genuinely in the best interests of the boys as opposed to the interests of those pharmaceutical companies? The inquiry looked at Dr. Aaronstrom's book in some detail. It was RLIT 40666. And at page 0107 therein, it identified the onset of infectious diseases of hepatitis and AIDS from concentrates arising from prophylaxis use. Dr. Aaronstrom therein says that the patients should discuss this with their own doctors. Well, the evidence we've heard is submitted that Dr. Aaronstrom did not even attempt to pay lip service to having any discussions with his patients, obtaining informed consent, and that prophylaxis use of plasma products could be unacceptable. That's not a conversation he ever had. There is a fair bit we could say on Dr. Aaronstrom, but I'm going to potentially highlight two matters with the use of prophylaxis at the college and also his attendance at the Excelsior Hotel at London Heathrow. If I turn to the first of those, there are three elements that I'd seek to flag up for you. The inquiry has investigated proposed trials in 1977, following a previous trial between 76 and 77. Three aspects of that. When that proposal was produced before UK HCDO in January 1977, you will note there Professor Stewart expressing some concerns about the large-scale use of prophylactic treatments. That is in PRSE 302268 at 0010. I'll take you back to the Haemophilia Society Bulletin in 1981 of Sister Turk, HSOC 2022908. In terms of prophylaxis, she identifies there that it was used extensively at Trelaws for a variety of reasons. And she gives a list of some of those reasons. Treatment of target joints, that's understandable potentially. Short-term use when school examination periods occur. Perhaps less understanding, you may feel. Short-term use on long journeys are undertaken, so at half-term and at the end of term holidays. Pause there for one moment. If they're being given these for those journeys, that means they're given these at least 6 times a year for the purposes of being on a journey. And the last element she identifies is prior to any discos, visiting rock concerts or football matches. She then adds, this may seem rather irresponsible. You may feel that is potentially an underestimate. Contrast that with the treatment sheet we saw of Mr. Warwick, which identified 25 consecutive days in May 1982 in use of prophylactic factor VIII without any bleeds. You'll find that in WITN 1592023_0001. The context of which was that his home treating clinician had been assured that he would remain on cryobilan, which clearly he wasn't. And the second limb identified was Dr. Aaronstrom's attendance at the Excelsior Hotel on London Heathrow on the 24th of January 1983. This has been touched upon by Mr. Snowden this morning. From his attendance there, we know 2 aspects. One is that the immuno company were discussing with those clinicians the prospect of virally inactivated products at that meeting. And we've also heard evidence that there were heat-treated products available in the US from March 1983. The second limb from that is that the incidence of AIDS was discussed at length at that meeting. Its incubation periods, its association with blood products, and in particular US concentrate products. Lawrence, if we could have HCDO 301686_001. Thank you. If we could turn to the first page, please. We're going up. In the bottom right-hand corner, 0001. Brilliant. Thank you very much. Now, bearing in mind that occurred in January 1983, we have here the UK HCDO returns for Trelaws for 1983. And you see that total amount of material used during 1983. Of significance here is there were safer products available, not least cryoprecipitate.
What's the mark over the 3 after 1980? There's some sort of pencil mark being put over that.
That's just been highlighted.
No, the top left-hand corner.
I think that's just the date. It seems to have been smudged or something.
Thank you. Yeah.
But we know it's 1983 because if we drop down to total amount of material used, it says during 1983, and then we have the 3 asterisks.
Yes, thank you.
Straight to the footnote. So we know it's for that year. Simply highlighting for you that cryoprecipitate was 0 use, which is perhaps the safest of the options open at that time. You will note from these figures NHS use of factor VIII concentrate totals 858581. Factor 9, right at the bottom of that list, would appear to be 21730. It stretches across. We add those up. Having total those up, the total units used is 3,371,560, of which cryoprecipitate was 0%. NHS factor VIII and factor 9, because of course factor 9 was used at the college as well, it's 31.9% works out at, and commercial concentrates 68.9%. 0.1%. So it's roughly 32% NHS, 68% commercial, of which 0% cryoprecipitate. That is in the same year that Dr. Aaronstrom has attended Heathrow. The same year where he knows unquestionably what the risks and the hazards are, and his reaction to that was to distribute therapeutic materials in that vein. There were a number of trials that we've heard about in Miss Richards' presentations throughout 1970 and 1980s. I'm not going to go through all of those. I'm simply going to highlight some for your consideration. Prophylactic trials of factor concentrates. You will see a UK HCDO meeting discussing such on the 27th of October 1972 at HCDO. Thank you, Lawrence. 301015. I flagged that up. You will see in that meeting there were concerns and objections potentially raised. You might term those disquiet on pages 5 and 8 by other clinicians on ethical and practical grounds. At page 12 therein, you will note that it had been stressed that the needs of the haemophilia centres had been stressed to the regional health authorities and the Board of Governors. So the school clearly knew about that, but there's no indication of what the haemophiliac needs of the afflicted boys were as opposed to the needs of the haemophilia centres. And then turn to the 1975 commercial concentrates and hepatitis trial. If we may have AMRE, please, Lawrence. 5011 underscore 006. Thank you. If we read the first paragraph at the top, Lord Mayor Trelaw College is a unique establishment since there are more than 50 boys suffering from various coagulant defects, namely haemophilia, Christmas disease and von Willebrand's disease, in residence at the college for approximately 264 days each year. These boys usually come to the college at the age of 11 and leave at the age of 16 to 18 years of age. They are therefore under continual medical supervision for 9 months of the year and often for many years. We then turn over the page. If we go to the second paragraph on the bottom, please. The present arrangements. The present arrangements at the college are particularly suitable for a specific type of research into haemophilia and other coagulation disorders, namely the study of relationships between laboratory findings and close day-to-day clinical observations. It is the only establishment in the United Kingdom which can provide the opportunity and the facilities for extensive clinical trials of various kinds of treatment which cannot at present be conducted elsewhere. This is the unique nature of the college which was pursued by those clinicians. And if we turn over to page 4, please, Lawrence. We go to the bottom paragraph starting the existence. The existence of commercial concentrates of human factor VIII has led to the much more liberal use of fractions prepared from large donor pools in the treatment of haemophilia. The consequences for the patients of this increased treatment are improved protection from crippling deformity and much extended horizons of possible activities. But the danger of contracting the blood-borne viruses causing hepatitis is also increased. The residence of these boys is in one place provides an ideal opportunity to study this complication of the treatment. Now, you may feel that this trial was a willful infliction of harm, of hepatitis, on the subjects of that trial, namely these boys. The evidence we've heard has fueled the survivors' reflection or perception that their treatment was a form of research for the benefit of others, rather than for their own best interests. And despite suggestions to the contrary, it's clear that neither they nor their parents were ever gave informed consent to any research of that nature, let alone being informed of those risks. So if I may conclude, many questions, thank you, Lawrence, have been addressed. Thank you very much for that. The clinicians and the school need to accept its failings, and until they do so, shame on them. The government needs to stop with their denials and delays and degradation mentioned by Mr. Snowden of the infected and the affected. And I'd like to finish with a brief paragraph from one of the surviving Trelaw's boys. I believe this was written at the time of the Archer inquiry, and it still holds today. And in it he says, "So where were our advocates and advocacy? Where were our protectors? Where were our safety nets before we hit the ground? Only to be buried in that ground, both metaphorically and literally, in the ashes of the schoolmates we lost, survived only by the doused embers of those ashes. Our flames cannot burn bright as once they would have done. Why did no one blow the whistles outside of the sports field, whilst we were turning jaundiced, later to be infected with hepatitis and HIV? There wasn't anybody for us. Our subsequent reality became a bleached white Milton steriliser reality. We were left amongst the school bags, young boys with death sentences handed out to us like exam grades instead. All we wanted was that brighter future promised to us when we entered the school gates." Thank you, Sir Brian.
Thank you, Mr. Cummins.
I'll then hand back to Mr. Snowden. Thanks.
So back to me. I take the place as he has described, the tall, handsome one, who now sits down. So I hope in the remaining time we have available to us to say something brief about government and civil service and clinicians, chapters 3 and 4 of what we've written, then to deal briefly again, if I may, or as briefly as is appropriate, with recommendations touching for a moment on inquests and what we say about compensation. So I'll be as brief as I may through each topic. First, dealing, if I may, with government and civil servant clinicians, the common strand that runs through them, of course, is their response to hepatitis non-A, non-B, which we discussed earlier on, but also their response to HIV. And again, as I did with non-A, non-B, I'm not going to take the time to take you, sir, through a series of documents with which you are already familiar, but to bracket the dates so that we can then see how the civil servants and the clinicians reacted within that bracket of dates. And insofar as we have useful, or rather cogent dates, forgive me, we start in July of 1982 with the MMWR report in the States of 3 cases of pneumocystis in United States haemophiliacs who had had commercial concentrates. Now, that provokes, and we're going to look at one document rather swiftly, if we could please, Lawrence, PRSE 303007. Thank you. And this was the initial reaction in the Department of Health to that news of what were clearly ultimately identified as AIDS symptoms in haemophiliacs. And you'll see that it's a letter, or it's a memo rather, of July of 1982.
That date is at the bottom, is it?
That date is at the bottom, yes, bottom left.
16th of July.
16th of July 1982.
Okay.
Sorry, yes. It's headed American Factor 8. You will wish to know that blank, our blank in blood transfusion has received information from the American Bureau of Biologics via, again the name is redacted, that there may be considerable publicity in the next few weeks concerning the safety of American Factor 8. There's then a layman's explanation, which, as it turns out, is not entirely correct, as we now understand the development and the etiology of AIDS and HIV. But we see two reactions at this very early stage. One is the reaction, as I would characterise it, of the civil servants, which is the, ooh, this is going to be problematic, are we in trouble? And you see that in the third substantive paragraph. From the DHSS point of view, we can defend the National Blood Transfusion Service's own records. Someone taking drugs, gay or not, would not be bled, provided the injection marks showed. So the first response appears to be a defensive one. And we say that characterises, we'll invite you to conclude, as we do through our written submissions, that characterises some of the civil service response through the greater part of this period. Interestingly, though, there's almost as an afterthought at the end, a glimmer of hope which sadly isn't ever pursued. At the bottom of that same paragraph, or rather from the middle of that same paragraph, you'll see, however, about half of the Factor 8 bought from commercial companies is imported from the USA. Your division, when the published study is available, I understand that one of your sections scans the technical literature for such material, may have to consider revoking licenses of certain manufacturers. Of course, it may turn out that none of the Factor 8 involved is supplied to this country. So two things we see simultaneously. One is the defensiveness, which unfortunately appears to be the line which continues thereafter. The second would have been a good idea had it been followed through. Closer scrutiny, greater attention, and ultimately preventing the import of those products. Thank you, Lawrence. We can take that down. So that's the mid part of July 1982. So you know the chronology then moves on through the end of 1982 and the reports and the first references to the baby in San Francisco, for whom at the age of 20 months there could be no explanation other than blood-borne viral transmission, given that that baby had had multiple transfusions and then developed T-cell immunodeficiency. By the January of 1983, so again, you'll be familiar with, we've looked in the inquiry numerous times at the Desforge article in the New England Journal of Medicine, where the author observes, unfortunately, the data are consistent with greater potential for AIDS in the population treated with concentrate. Physicians involved in the care of haemophiliacs must now be alive to this risk. Preventing the complications of the present treatment may have to take precedence over preventing the complications of haemophilia itself. Now again, we pause there and say, if only that course had been followed. Again, it was prescient, but it was January of 1983. We then move through the response of both government and clinicians in the United Kingdom. We have in May of 1983, skipping a number of stages, sir, with which you'll be familiar and which I'm not going to trouble you again because you know the evidence, but in May of 1983, Professor Bloom of Cardiff writes in the Haemophilia Society's bulletin or newsletter, saying, the cause of AIDS is quite unknown, and it has not been proven to result from the transmission of a specific infective agent in blood products. We are not aware of any proven case in our own haemophiliac population. While it would be wrong to be complacent, it would be equally counterproductive to alter our treatment programs radically. We should avoid precipitate action. Now, we pause to observe that precipitate action is precisely what was required. It would not have been considered precipitate had one taken into account the learning over the previous 6, 7, or 8 months, even in the context of its time. And what is also striking, sir, and you'll be familiar with this, of course, is that when Professor Bloom says we're not aware of any proven case, only 2 months previously, on the 17th of March of 1983, Professor Bloom had, on the 22nd of March, he had completed a form identifying that on the 17th of March, he had considered that Kevin Slater, of whom the inquiry has heard, the first patient to have developed AIDS as a haemophiliac, Professor Bloom attributed AIDS symptoms in that patient to his treatment. So there is it simply can't be reconciled, what Professor Bloom has said at those stages. But we move on from May 1983 through the Galbraith letter, which again we're all familiar with. Again, one could spend an awful lot of time on it and its particular consequences, but in this context it merely sets the scene that by May of 1983, a very respected and the only one to comment, epidemiologist, was calling for the temporary withdrawal of US products, not an absolutist position, but a temporary withdrawal until risks could be clarified. That advice disregarded in due course. By June of 1983, so again you'll be familiar, we won't show on the screen for sake of time, but Dr. Walford's briefing note, and perhaps it's instructive just to read a few parts of that. So Dr. Walford in the Department of Health, by the middle of 1983, appreciates that, she, in a note headed AIDS, a new disease, appreciates that mortality rate is at least 40%, there's no known cure. She identifies some of the risk factors. She uses the collection of H's, which we're all familiar with: homosexuals, heroin addicts, Haitian immigrants, and haemophiliacs. But in that very same note, so in the middle of 1983, haemophiliacs, she says, it's thought the greatest risk to haemophiliacs at present is from the use of factor VIII concentrate prepared from American plasma. She identifies that certain commercial manufacturers are proposing to introduce heat-treated factor VIII concentrate, but there's no evidence whatsoever that such material reduces the risk of causing AIDS. Back to the previous page, so again, you'll be familiar with the document, and I won't show it, but she says the cause of AIDS is unknown, but the evidence is suggestive that it may be a virus. So we have a suggestion on which, at that point, no further action is taken. We come to June of 1983, and I am, if you'll forgive me, going to show one more document, MACK, if we could, Lawrence, please, MACK 40307, and page 002. And this, so again, it's a document we'll all be familiar with, having been in the hearings. It's the Council of Europe recommendation R83-8. And Lawrence, if we can go please to the bottom of page 2. Thank you very much. You will see that after setting out the principles, the basic principles as they're described in the middle of that page to minimise the hazard of transmissible infectious diseases, and then the bottom paragraph, recognising the necessity to provide pertinent information to blood donors, attending physicians and selected recipient groups in order to avoid, so far as possible, donation by persons in risk groups. And if they come over to the top of the page, next please. This is the Council of Europe recommends the governments and member states, 1, to take all necessary steps and measures with respect to AIDS, and in particular, and then we have the 3 bullet points, to avoid wherever possible the use of coagulation factor products prepared from large plasma pools. The second bullet point, to inform attending physicians and selected recipients, such as haemophiliacs, of the potential health hazards of chemotherapy and the possibilities of minimising these risks. And 3 is to provide all blood donors with information so those in risk groups will refrain from donating. And we pause there to observe that although the government response in a memo of July 83 from Mr. Cummins is summarised, perhaps this is where things... We may find an explanation here for how ministers thought they had complied with the recommendation of the Council of Europe, but had not in fact, because Mr. Cummins inaccurately summarises these 3, I'll call them requirements, or recommendations, as follows. He talks about, we can leave this on the screen please while I'm describing the memo. He says, from time to time we submit to ministers international instruments which involve DHSS interests. It is a normal practice during the preparation of these documents to ensure the UK is not committed to policies which would not otherwise be followed. So there is correspondingly no action to be taken. It sounds very yes minister. We'll only say yes to something that doesn't require us to do anything. But he describes this document in this way. He says, on the basis of present knowledge, it is assumed that AIDS is transmissible by blood, and the recommendation aims to ensure that appropriate precautions are taken in the preparation of certain blood products, and that specific groups of recipients, such as haemophiliacs, are accordingly reassured. And one can see immediately from the text which is still on the screen, that's not what it says. It says avoid wherever possible. It says inform the recipients of the health hazards and of the possibilities of minimising these risks. So what we have is a recommendation of the Council of Europe to which it seems it was thought that consent had been given because it wouldn't really require anyone to do anything, and then a civil servant describing that it really doesn't require anyone to do anything, which is absolutely not what it says on its face. Notwithstanding that, many other steps in the chronology, but from June 1983 we move on until eventually in November 1983 we come to, as we all know, Kenneth Clarke, as he then was, describing in a statement to the House of Commons that there is no conclusive proof of the link between products and HIV. So there's the extraordinary window of relevance. So I imagine numerous pages and chapters of your report are going to be devoted to the developments between the end of 1982 and the end of 1983 and into 1984. But that's the time span into which I want to make 2 or 3 observations about the approach, first of all, of ministers and politicians and civil servants, and then secondly, about the approach of clinicians. So against that background, we saw in our written submissions at chapters 2 and 3, 3 and 4. No, try again, 4 and 5. 4 and 5. Chapter 4, we described politicians, and we used 3 words to describe the attitude of the politicians and the interaction between them and their civil servants. We described it as ignorance, arrogance, and dependence. And in respect of those, so we sort of explain that as follows. In terms of ignorance, we're not necessarily calling any politician stupid. We're talking about ignorance of facts, ignorance of pertinent information. And the way we describe it in our written submission is a number of factors combined to ensure that information was siloed within the hierarchy of government, so that its absence went unnoticed. This in turn meant that unavoidable and unjustifiable delays occurred with accountability, and that egregious decisions were not brought to light. So the ignorance of the right hand from what the left is doing, put another way. And we say identify that amongst the factors that contributed to the ignorance of government were that blood policy was merely one of a large number of portfolios of responsibilities. It appears not to have been seen, until AIDS became more prominent, as an area of priority. There's a high turnover of ministers, which means, in effect, fresh learning and an absence of scrutiny from ministers of what civil servants were doing. There was, we say, you can discern through the evidence you've heard, in general, a deference to the medical part of the dual hierarchy in the civil service. In that, those who were medical officers, their views largely were treated as gospel and not challenged. And consequently, there was a great deal of dependence by ministers on officials, and very little scrutiny, or indeed little ability to scrutinise the submissions being made by the officials to the ministers. So that's the sense in which we use ignorance. We also, though, use it in the sense of what I can cheekily call pass the parcel. We say at paragraphs 141, 142, 143 of our submissions, Lord Clarke blamed the medical advice the department received for the misleading phrase, no conclusive proof. He says it's his officials who have misadvised him. They kept the pertinent information from him. Dr. Walford, one of those officials, says about the Galbraith letter, the important one we've talked about the temporary withdrawal of US concentrate imports. Dr. Walford said, I didn't see that the paper had been copied to anyone in the medicines division, so I don't know if medicines division was aware. But I would certainly have said that would be the place it should have gone, and ministers should have been told what the outcome was. Howsoever it happened, we're playing a game of pass the parcel. The minister says he didn't know because he wasn't told by his officials. The officials say they won't know because they didn't know because it was sent to the wrong department or passed elsewhere. So that's the concept of ignorance. In terms of what we describe as arrogance, sir, we talk about, in our written submissions, and I'll expand on it only slightly now, an inability of self-reflection about their own ignorance, in the sense nobody minded, nobody seemed terribly troubled that they didn't know these things at the time. The business of government could carry on perfectly well in the minds of many ministers without having to consider whether errors of judgment were being made. We say there's also the general sense in which arrogance is used. Core participants will have been astonished and hurt by statements from some ministers delivered during the course of their evidence to this inquiry. One example from Lord Clark. Asked by Miss Richards, the inquiry has heard evidence from families, patients, clinicians, which it might be said paint a fairly overwhelming picture of people not having risks drawn to their attention. Lord Clark, well, they must have been pretty switched off. Astonishing arrogance here in a public inquiry. And howsoever one characterises it, arrogance or want of care as to tone, Sir John Major, using the expression incredibly bad luck, which we'll all recall. So again, we talk about those as aspects of arrogance, and in terms of the sense of dependence, which we say characterises what went wrong in the relationship between ministers and their officials. In our written submission, we simply say this: the views of committees were rarely presented with differences of opinion, so you know, and you've heard that. Differences of opinion retained in the minutes. Add this to the reliance of ministers on their civil servants, and the picture is of one with a government with few outside influences. Witnesses unequivocally accepted that ideas could get entrenched in government. Both officials, such as Rowena Geacock, who gave evidence, and ministers, including John Major, concluded that the civil service is the corporate memory of a department, and that this places a higher burden on officials to provide full and accurate briefings. In the face of the ignorance and the arrogance and the obvious dependence of one part of that system on the other, there's a substantially higher duty, we say, to be clear about what's known, what's understood, and what's being communicated. And if I may, I'm going to take just a moment to remind you of some of the aspects of ignorance and arrogance in the evidence of Lord Clark. Lord Clark's part of his evidence given on the 27th of July of 2021, when being asked about what could be done where the patient should be apprised of risks. He says, "What's no good going out there? I've said, although this tragedy is appalling, what actually happened, what should we have done? Just gone out and said, well, we think it's important in the public interest that we tell you you're going to die. And then they say, what am I meant to do about it? And we say, well, I'm afraid I don't think there's anything you can do unless you want to stop taking factor VIII. A combination of ignorance and arrogance. And when pressed then by Miss Richards about, well, why not stop taking factor VIII in those circumstances, Lord Clark replies in this way. She asks whether to stop, he says, whether you mean to stop taking factor VIII. Taking less wouldn't do any good. Well, the physicians, if they were remotely keeping up to date with things, they must have been aware there was this mounting concern. They had all the specialist knowledge. They don't just give themselves factor VIII. I don't know, personally, I have to admit, I don't know how you take factor VIII, so I apologise if you're given a pill which you take at home. But they all had highly specialised physicians treating them. A clear example of a combination of ignorance and arrogance in all senses. And again, when pressed a little later in the evidence by Miss Richards, do we correctly understand from something you said earlier that you were not aware of a treatment called cryoprecipitate? Never heard of it. Is that the treatment that preceded factor VIII? Preceded but also continued to be used to some extent. Continued to be used today, is it? Says Lord Clark. Again, the combinations of ignorance and arrogance which we characterise that relationship. In respect of Lord Glenarthur, just a couple of extracts of his evidence. I characterise them perhaps slightly more kindly as ignorance and dependence in Lord Glenarthur's case. He was asked about the Galbraith letter. And his reply was, I wasn't aware. I think at that stage, I don't think I would have necessarily expected to. Looking back, I think it would have been very useful to have been aware of it. But you know, so much of this stuff is being dealt with at various levels in the department by experts who understood it, all in great detail. And looking at this list of professors and others who were involved, they were all, you know, highly qualified in their field. It's only when difficulties arose, or political interests arose, or, you know, a whole series of things, that at that stage I would have thought they should be brought to ministers. One couldn't, as a minister, get involved in every single detail of those things. But looking back on it now, I wish I'd seen this, of the Galbraith letter. So there are, again, we could have fun for a day with the extracts of government ministers' evidence, but those, being more serious about it, illustrate the combination of ignorance, arrogance, and dependence. In relation to clinicians, we say over the same time frame, initially, of course, the time frame of the development of awareness of non-A, non-B, and then growing awareness of HIV and its consequences. We recognise in our written submissions, particularly paragraph 221, that you have heard evidence of what we call, happy to describe, both good practice and devastatingly atrocious practice on the part of clinicians. We've described what we mean by that, and I won't elaborate on that any further here, but you have... We ask the question in our written submissions, and I'll ask it again orally here, why did clinicians allow imported large pool concentrates to be used in light of what the inquiries heard, in light of what we talked about earlier on, about the prevalence of non-A, non-B, and the growing awareness of its risks? And we suggest in our written submissions that the answer might lie in the unique nature of haemophilia, the unusual position that a group of self-selecting experts in that condition formed themselves into what was in effect their club, determining for themselves the national strategy in their specialist area. And unlike other aspects of medicine, these weren't patients who were just seen once and then perhaps not again for the rest of their lifetime. These were patients who were destined to spend their lives in regular contact with these clinicians, engendering a close relationship, but also making them an ideal cohort for study, as you've heard, and as Mr. Cummins has described in relation to the Lord Mayor Law School. And we suggest that that may well have led clinicians to lose sight of the particular duties they owed to each individual patient. And the pursuit of science, we suspect, surpassed the care for the individual patients. We deal with it a little bit more in writing, but I'm going to leave it there with an eye on the clock. One thing which is worth flagging up, and I do it briefly and orally now, is the conflict which there appears to be in the retrospective justification for what clinicians did or did not do between the clinical papers published around and about the 1980s. One relied on by Dr. Christine Lee and others is a paper by Minucci in 2003, which is in effect I was going to say revisionist history. No, it purports to be a history of the treatment of haemophilia and what was known and what was seen and what clinicians were aware of. But what's striking, and so I'd refer you, you know I've read it, I know you have read it, paragraph 253 of our note is we say inexplicable, so you might find an explanation for it, none that we know of has yet been ventured. But in Minucci's 2003 paper, looking back on the history of how haemophilia clinicians treated their patients, he talks about a study which he describes as being of 10 haemophiliacs, no case of progression towards cirrhosis or hepatocellular carcinoma. Yet when one looks back at the original 1982 report, there were 11 patients in that study originally, not 10. The 11th patient had active cirrhosis and died of liver failure. And it becomes very difficult indeed to see how those two papers sit well with each other, unless at least part of the conscious or subconscious purpose of the 2003 paper is somewhat revisionist of the history. So those... Apparently I'm talking too fast. I'll slow down for your stenographers. So there's not much more...
I think I'm following... I'm not sure everyone will catch the speed with which you're giving it.
Right.
But if you take a little longer, that'll be fine, as long as it's not too much longer.
Don't worry. We've reached a point where I think we're very close indeed to stopping. There's little more, I think, to be said here and today, beyond what we've put in writing, on the subject of clinicians and the government. Those, we respectfully suggest, are some of the highlights. What I was going to do, but sir, I know you have already been acutely aware of, is to invite you to go back and look at Professor Savage's report in respect of Susan Hallwood's son, which, as I flagged up at the beginning of my submissions to you, puts their clinical treatment, the boy's clinical treatment, in the context of those dates which I've outlined for you now, and identifies shocking, truly shocking, failures to comply with what was known, what was being advised, and what should have been done at the various times. And that is the document which I described earlier, which unequivocally, in Professor Savage's view, describes that treatment as negligent, and negligent, and negligent. So I'll leave that and come towards the end of our submissions now. We have provided for you as much information as we can, synthesizing the views of as many of our core participants as is possible in respect of the recommendations we invite you to make and in respect of compensation. I'm going to take it slightly out of sequence. One of the recommendations we make in a small chapter of its own is related to inquests and the coronial process, coroners. We note that it may well be that it was released only yesterday, or it may well be that it made its way to me only yesterday, but the inquiry has now produced a presentation on coroners. Our main points in respect of inquests are these: that in respect of inquests which took place in the 1980s and the 1990s, there is real doubt and there's a conflict of evidence. It may be that different things happened in different areas, and so you don't necessarily need to make findings about it. We don't necessarily invite you to. But whether the obscuring of the true cause of death on death certificates and in coroners' verdicts, as they were in the 1980s and 90s, was at the behest of families seeking to not broadcast publicly the cause of death of the deceased, or, as perhaps there's a suggestion through Dr. Jones in Newcastle, at the request of clinicians to save, possibly at the request of clinicians to save the intensity or the draw on resources of having to attend so many coroners' inquests. Now, our submission is, now that we are some distance removed in time from the 80s and 90s, that concern falls away. And a majority, a good number of our core participants have expressed to us the desire that death certificates and coroners' conclusions, as they now are, should be full and frank and unstinting in their attribution of cause of death to aspects of haemophilic care or treatment or hepatitis arising from blood transfusions. With permission of one of our CPs, I'm going to show you, if I may, one final document, COLL 5024. And this is the record of inquest of a very recent inquest, which you will see. It was opened, sorry, let me find my paper version. It was opened in March 2019, but not concluded until, that's interesting, I've not got the date. Never mind. Not concluded until the very end of last year. And it's an inquest into Steve Diamond, the husband of Sue Gorman. What I'd like to take you to, if I may, is first of all the aspects of medical cause of death, where we see there the coroner has identified 1A, liver failure, 1B, cirrhosis, 1C, hepatitis C infection acquired from a contaminated blood product, and then the underlying condition, which is Roman 2, haemophilia. And in this case, the coroner chose to identify and give a narrative verdict. So, Lawrence, if we could just scroll down a little so as to leave 4 at the top of the page, that's fine, thank you. And so you'll see what is said there. Now the names are redacted, but they do, I think, need to be redacted unless I'm in trouble. They don't need to be redacted. No, I thought they didn't need to be in this case. What it says is Stephen, known as Steve Diamond, had mild haemophilia A. Between 1976 and 1984, he was treated on 3 occasions with factor VIII concentrate, a product developed to treat haemophilia. At least one of the factor VIII treatments he was given was contaminated with hepatitis C. In 1984...
1994?
Sorry, 1994, I'm so sorry. He was diagnosed with hepatitis C. As a result of the infection with hepatitis C, he suffered a variety of mental and physical symptoms which impacted on his university education, his career, his marriage, and his ability to have children. There was little or no support available, and the stigma of the virus created isolation, frustration, and sadness at the loss of a life imagined. He subsequently developed cirrhosis as a recognised complication of hepatitis C. He was also diagnosed with cancer of the liver and portal hypertension. Both conditions are complications of cirrhosis. Now, there's then a further description of the medical treatment that was involved in the final days and hours. But we scroll down to the very bottom of the screen as it shows at the moment. Stephen Diamond's death is the direct consequence of being given factor VIII between 1976 and 1984, which was contaminated with hepatitis C. Now, again, I sought express permission to show this, and Miss Gorman told me that Steve would have been pleased that something more comes of his death and his inquest. But that is the sort of verdict which is not only helpful, but right. And what we do in our written submissions is we invite you to be involved in liaison with the Chief Coroner, to encourage the Chief Coroner to draw up some guidance, to allow the Chief Coroner to recommend that when your report is produced, coroners can refer to it, and to facilitate the production of, where appropriate, narrative verdicts like this, which properly, truly and honestly and helpfully record what happened. So that's all we say at coroners for now. In terms of recommendations, coming close to conclusion, if I may, we've expressed our core participants' feelings on recommendations and compensation using, again, 3 words, and we invite you to use language like it, if not the same language, in your report. What they seek is closure, reassurance, and financial security. Closure will come from a combination of, we hope, the findings of this inquiry and the recommendations made. The reassurance is likely to come from the recommendations made in respect of future treatment and care, and that things will change. The financial security is an aspect of the compensation, obviously, but it's the combination of those 3 things, as we express it in our written submissions, which is what our clients, our core participants, seek. It's to restore their dignity, to preserve their health, and to provide the security that was taken away. One of our core participants, in giving his evidence, said this to you: "This has been my whole life. Even though I try not to let it consume me, this has identified me and has become me for as long as I can remember, even though I've tried hard to live independently of it all. It affects almost every facet and decision in life. There are no winners, no happy ending to this morally impoverished situation. What has happened cannot be changed. The damage done to my community is irreversible. There are depths of pain you can scarcely imagine until you actually get there. It's often taken my physical health, and more recently it's taken my emotional and mental fortitude. It's left me a shell of a human being at times. I've often felt broken. I'm just tired. And we say, sir, we invite you, and I know you will take up the opportunity, to arrive at a combination of recommendations of practical steps, of recommendations in respect of apologies and memorials, of recommendations in respect of compensation, to do insofar as is possible the right thing in respect of the individual that the cohort that he typifies, so far as possible to remedy that situation. So I'm not going to dwell, in light of the time, in any real detail on many of our recommendations. We provided a number, all of which we reflect back to you what our core participants have said to us. You'll have observed that at paragraph 799 of our written submissions, we identify some as being the more crucial ones to our clients than others. First is an apology. Now, sir, again, you heard what I said about an apology earlier on. We still don't know quite what's been apologised for. We're none the wiser at the end of the exchange of written submissions, at least. We may be a little wiser tomorrow, who knows? I hope we will be. But we set out in some detail there the strength of feeling amongst our core participants about what should be included in apology. That it's not simply saying sorry, that there must be some change of perspective. An apology involves change of behaviour, a reflection that something's gone wrong and is to be changed. So we look for an open apology in the House of Commons by the Prime Minister, and published alongside, to evidence the genuineness of that apology, a long-term commitment to remedy and make reparation to all of the victims of this scandal. The government undertaking not to seek the enforcement of any previous compromises or settlements, as Sir Robert Francis has recommended, that what's in the past should be left there, and people should be allowed to step forwards free of it. A government commitment accompanying that apology to create and fund a body comprised of a representative cross-section of core participants and groups to consider annually and review the process of identification of infected persons, their treatment, their welfare, their care, their eligibility, if you like, a commitment that an apology means doing something seriously different in the future, that steps should be put in place. We deal more at greater length with the apology in writing. Memorials. You heard Mr. Cummins talk about the stained glass window at Trelawn's. That isn't right, and it isn't enough. So again, we describe the significance that would be attached to memorials, not simply to be a point of reflection or contemplation or remembrance or grieving, but a memorial also will stand as a reminder or a warning to us all of what can happen when things go wrong. So in a sense, it's not simply to be a looking backwards and grieving moment, it's to be a salutary reminder to take care for the future is something that can be achieved by a memorial in a public place, and the significance that goes with the erection of that memorial. We also make recommendations, invite you to make recommendations in respect of improved patient treatment, consent record keeping, tax and practical implications, coroners we've talked about. And then, having reflected on the written submissions put in by others, we're very happy to endorse others' recommendation that there be a task force of some sort to ensure that such recommendations as you do make are properly and thoroughly and completely implemented. So those, in brief, are the recommendations we seek. There are others, of course, in writing. In terms of compensation, may I spend a moment or two on this? I think I still have 10 minutes left. We come back to the themes, if we may, of closure, reassurance, and financial security. And this is the financial security aspect. What we suggest is that there is a world of difference, as the inquiry knows and has heard, between the systems which have pertained to date, which have been no more than support, and the language of compensation, which even in its language recognises that something has gone wrong. We know, and Sir, you know, that High Court judges regularly recognise in their judgments, in claims in tort for catastrophic personal injuries, the impossibility of turning back the clock or of undoing all of the effects of a tort or some negligence or a wrong. And judges, as indeed you when sitting as a judge would have done, recognise that a financial award of damages in a civil court can never truly compensate an individual for their suffering of a life-changing injury. But we suggest that this inquiry is in the fortunate and better position than the average High Court judge, in that it can improve on the remedies and the interaction amongst the remedies that would otherwise not be available to a judge. By giving closure through your conclusions, by giving non-financial remedies and compensation, we use not quite religious but close to religious language and suggest that you could achieve, this inquiry should achieve something closer to the concepts of reparation or restoration or restitution, not in a legal sense, and perhaps even using the language of the Reverend David Armstrong in the Haemophilia Remembrance Service, redemption. And you'll remember, sir, the evocative language used by Professor Sir Jonathan Van Tam, who referred to his hope that people would be able to create a new future. It is all evocative language, but with the submission we make is this inquiry can come as close as possible to achieving that for those who have been, we say, so badly wronged. Coming to some of the detail of the compensation arrangements, we, in the very broadest of terms, support the framework devised by Sir Robert Francis. He was instructed by the government as an independent reviewer. He has, sir, as you know, immense experience of medico-legal work and conducting inquiries himself, is utterly impartial. We observe today that there is no obvious good reason for, if you recommend it, the government not to follow a recommendation made by you and by their own independent reviewer. As I say, in the broadest terms, we agree with the recommendations he makes. We make it clear, as one of our core participants pointed out to us that we hadn't in writing, that we include, as he did, natural clearers within the compensation scheme for an award which is appropriate for the wrong that they have had done to them, recognising that it will inevitably be of a shorter scale and of a lesser magnitude than others. We recognise that Sir Robert's proposed framework has many points of reference to how courts work in civil claims, to how personal injuries damages, or fatal accident damages, or clinical negligence damages are assessed. We recognise that what he suggests and we endorse is rather like what those of us with long memories will recall how the Criminal Injuries Compensation Board initially operated when it was set up. And we recognise, though, the tension, and we know, sir, that you recognise the tension between something which can be operated still fairly but swiftly, as quickly as possible, as efficiently as possible, as against, at the other end of the spectrum, a long, drawn-out, complicated, unsatisfactory adversarial process. We don't recommend anything at either end of that spectrum, but we do recommend something on that scale closer to a legal process for the very reasons that Sir Robert himself recognised, which are that to have the confidence of those who will be receiving compensation through the scheme, they should be reassured and recognise that it reflects what society as a whole considers to be reasonable, and that is reflected in the way the courts themselves assess damages. I see there's some trepidation, sir, that you've removed your mask, which suggests a question is coming.
Well, it wasn't necessarily coming, but I was wondering what whether what you're submitting is that the Irish system takes too long,
Well,
or aspects of it do.
aspects of the Irish system might take too long. Our concern, though, or the concern that has been expressed to us by the majority of our core participants, and so you'll appreciate that amongst a cohort as large as ours, we have a huge range of views on how compensation schemes should operate. To an extent, I'm trying not to impress my own views on top of my clients' views, my core participants' views, to express them to you. The question of whether a system takes too long is a matter of two factors, is it not? One is how complicated the system itself is to take any case through it, and the other is how many cases come crashing into it all at once. How many drivers arrive at the traffic lights all at the same time. What Sir Robert has tried to do as we read his report, and what we encourage you to do, and what you have already done in part through the first stage of interim payments, is to, so far as possible, seek to satisfy as many of the potential claims as might be possible in a quick and expedient way. But what we hold back from encouraging you to do is to say the whole system should be so simple that it becomes so removed from the measure of damages that a court would award. The system by which it's awarded could change, but different in measure, we say, would be wrong and would feel wrong and wouldn't give the court participants who are going through it the same reassurance that Sir Robert intends them to have.
So what you're submitting is that it must bear as you would see it, a visible relationship to the sorts of awards which a court might give.
Yes.
Without itself being as detailed as a court award, and certainly not taking as long as it might take to get a court award.
Precisely so. So that's exactly our submission. It needs to bear appropriate comparison. So I've set out in writing, again, today's not a law lecture, so you know your law better than I do.
And Sir Robert's approach to that was, as it were, a bedrock award plus personalised elements.
Yes, that is exactly
and
right.
that you're saying that your clients would support.
Yes, we would. We would. And he, of course, has identified, we make a number of technical submissions, which, sir, I know you will have read, and I have no doubt you will have understood, but which are probably not appropriate to be explored in technical detail here today, about, for instance, the damages figure, as we might call it, the award figure, and what correlation that bears to an award of general damages in common law, the function and the purpose of an award of general damages in common law. And so I've probably bored you slightly with page 242 and a number of observations about the retail prices index and how things ratchet up from the figures which Sir Robert used to derive his figures for the range of his proposed impact awards. And so just to dwell for a moment, because I do like the technicalities of these kinds of things, to dwell on that for a moment, RPI, of course, is released by the Office of National Statistics every month. There's a further release due tomorrow, in fact. Paragraph 874 of our submissions, page 242, identified that at the date at which we wrote it, never mind the Simmons and Castle uplift, which is a matter for you to decide, and we've put down in writing what we say about that, and the reasons why we say that would still be appropriate to achieve parity, comparability with common law damages. But never mind that. As at today's calculation, rather than increasing Sir Robert's figures by 19.3%, retail prices index takes us to a 19.9, virtually 20% increase on the figures he has there. And so, sir, that you can get a sense of the comparison, the top of the bracket, and I bear in mind it's only the bracket Sir Robert proposes, while he suggests that a panel might be better suited to assess the precise figures, but the top of his bracket comes out at a shade over £377,000 as a damages award figure. And so, of course, you will know that the most catastrophic cases proceeding through the courts of utterly life-transforming brain or spinal injury in the very worst possible situation, today attract awards in the region of about £470,000. So somewhere on the scale between the broken finger and the most catastrophic injury one can imagine, we say it's absolutely right to put these figures very much closer to the top end of that scale. And that's where Sir Robert's figures would fall on the current evidence. So we make some other submissions as well about the form of the award, which again are technical in their nature in relation to periodical payments, the possibility for capitalising as opposed to annualising payments under a scheme like this. But to put it simply, so it reflects a principle which you will have been familiar with in practice and as a judge, which is that while the development of periodical payments in common law cases for clinical negligence and personal injury is hugely helpful in that it can provide a long-term and guaranteed stream of income, it doesn't suit everyone. Some people wish to be cut free from their tort fees, or some people wish to be cut free from the annual accountability. Some people do wish to say, I want once and for all to have this settled and done and put behind me, and turn 180 degrees and march off in another direction, metaphorically. And that's allowing people the choice of one or the other, or a combination of those, we say reflects individuals' own preferences and reflects their personal autonomy. And that must be, we suggest, a clear component of any compensation scheme. So I'm not sure that there's very much more I can assist you with in respect of the compensation scheme itself. Two further points, though. One is this, that a number of our clients have made, we haven't made in writing, but a number of our clients, a substantial number, have made strong representations that you should recommend further going back and revisiting of equalling up or parity under the various existing support schemes. That is, not to deal with compensation at all, or rather not to ignore compensation, but as a quite separate aspect from compensation, to go back and recommend further changes or levelling up or parity. Once one starts down that route, it's difficult to see where one can stop, save that there is perhaps one step down that route which might be recognised, which is that there are clearly, as you know, categories of people who have been excluded to date. Parents of children, children of parents who died. And so there may be, and we urge you to consider whether there is, scope to recommend that some levelling up retrospectively would be appropriate in respect of those classes of individuals. I say that in the broadest of terms, and I say it briefly because I don't want to distract from the main submission which relates to compensation.
Well, do any of your clients want to make a point in respect of those who may have suffered hepatitis B infection?
We make no specific point about that ourselves, but are very happy to endorse the points made by others. So the only thing that then remains is to deal with what I alluded to at the very beginning of my submissions, which is the potential that, of course, your report is going to take some time to write, and rightly so, but the potential that there may be yet further delay and passage of time after that before any sort of compensation scheme is implemented and before anyone can apply and benefit from it. So we've suggested, and I'm happy to expand on or happy simply to mention and leave, two possibilities. One is that adopting our interim submissions on interim payments, which, sir, I know you have and I won't repeat here, we in that document proposed a logical rationale falling within Sir Robert's proposed framework by which interim payments of £100,000 could, we suggested, also and should also have been made to estates, and in that sense would then benefit some of the groups currently excluded from compensation or support. Parents would be able to apply in respect of their the bereavement of the loss of their child, children in respect of a parent. So that's the first argument that we put before you. We've already put it in writing. I don't seek to expand on it any further unless you ask me to. But the second is a slightly more radical and slightly broader point, which is this. If it is going to take some time, and if, sir, you share our enormous discomfort with the attitude so far adopted by the government, or the lack of progress towards, or the lack of information about progress towards a compensation scheme, and if, sir, you share our real concern that by acting that way they have evaded the scrutiny of all of the infected and affected, of your team of counsel to the inquiry, and indeed of yourself in respect of any scheme they propose, then an alternative might be this, that in the course of thinking about and considering your recommendations, insofar as it's possible, you focus first on compensation. And that, perhaps as well as recommending further interim payments, you make an interim report which is about a final compensation scheme. So insofar as you, sir, and we anticipate you probably are going to devise and flesh out this, a scheme, whether it's Sir Robert Francis's or slightly different, that as early as possible, that is published, so that while your inquiry still technically remains extant, and there's therefore the possibility of calling people back before the inquiry, you can see and can weigh up the response of government to your proposal in respect of compensation, and can, if necessary, apply the scrutiny that we would invite you to apply to any scheme that's proposed. We simply leave those both before you as options. So I'm not sure beyond that there is anything I can usefully say in respect of compensations. Of course, we remain very happy indeed to answer further questions on it if you have those. But if not, sir, I was going to do only two things in ending. The first being to restate, and I won't restate because it's already on the transcript, but to remind all who are listening here that we invited Miss Gray tomorrow to answer 6 questions, to clarify 6 issues for us. That invitation remains open. We will be delighted if it's taken up. If it can't be taken up tomorrow, we might in due course invite you to find some other time in the next 3 weeks when the invitation could be taken up. But sir, we're very serious about our concerns that things should be articulated and made clear in a process such as a public inquiry. So finally, we're going to end with a video clip. We're going to end with a video clip of a little boy called Lee Turton, the son of Colin and Denise, who gave evidence before you. I pause because I don't wish it to be invidious that we've picked one call participant to particularly remind you of. You know, sir, and you've heard and you remember the heartrending evidence of each and every infected person, bereaved spouse, bereaved child, bereaved parent. There are many other examples we could have chosen. Susan Hallwood, the Smiths in Cardiff, John Peach, who Mr. Cummins mentioned, who for the first time became involved in anything to do with this public inquiry when he gave evidence about his boys who died, having been exposed at Trelaws. Could also have focused on others who typify aspects of this scandal which have not yet been remedied, for whom no redress whatsoever has been available, like Lauren Palmer, who lost both of her parents. But this particular family's story, which you will remember, so I do no more than summarise it, illustrates so many aspects of what we've said in our submissions today, Mr. Cummins and I. It represents the huge number of children who were infected by this scandal. He, Lee, was one of the estimated 380 children who were given HIV. He, Lee, typifies the story of children being given concentrates when they should not have been. His initial assessment was that he was no more than a mild haemophiliac, 7%. Initially on cryoprecipitate as a baby, his parents were then told it wasn't available and they had to have concentrates from March 1982, when he was 10 months old. He continued to be given concentrates through 83, 84 and 85. He was HIV negative in February 84, positive by March 85. That story resonates with so many others that you've heard and so many other witness statements you will have read. But the family story also illustrates the stigma for the family, press intrusion about his school. Despite asking the GP not to tell the school found out. The family had to move to avoid stigma and abuse. It also represents the fact that the child's life has not yet been recognised for compensation, the parents who lost children who've been excluded from support schemes. Their story represents the long-term effects on parents, as you heard them give their evidence, and I won't repeat it now. It reflects that there have to date been no interim payments for those parents. Lee died at the age of 10. He died 31 years ago, almost to the day. They've waited that long. But for the utterly unacceptable treatment he received, he would have been a man of 41 today. So we recognise that there is an absolutely essential job of legal analysis to be done. I hope we have said what our core participants want. I know that others will focus on different parts of analysis, but this is not all about lawyers. This is not at all about lawyers. The inquiry is not about lawyers. I cannot think of a better way to give him and his family a voice than to end with him, not me. This is what pharmaceutical companies, clinicians, and the government have caused. This family's ongoing torment is as a result of government delay, denial, and failure to take responsibility. And this is what all the words we have written and spoken look like in real life.
Good morning, son. Merry Christmas to you. Alright?
Getting a stomachache.
Fella?
Stomachache.
You got a stomachache?
I couldn't get to sleep. The sun was there. It must be too full.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. We need a break. We'll take it until 5 to 4. 5 to 4.